I'd really like to welcome you to the webinar, which has been organised by the WHO Collaboration Centre for the Social, Political and Commercial Determinants of Health Equity, which is based at Flinders University, which is on the land of the Ghana people. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present. Thank you very much for coming along to the webinar. I think the topic we've got today is really crucial, which concerns the future of public universities. We've invited 4 speakers, each of whom have published a book that directly addresses this question of what are public universities like today and what are they likely to be in the future. And the way we're going to plan today's webinar is that each speaker will speak, and then they will be followed by a 5-minute discussant. So we have a team of panelists, and if we go up to there, you can see that our panelists are Andrew Miller, Sam Schultz, Professor Jenny Poppe and Alexandro Pelizon. So they will be speaking in turn after each of our main speakers. We've also, on the next slide, got, if you would like to tweet, please use the hashtags Good Universities, Higher Education and hashtag Academic Chatter. We hope that will get some conversation going on Twitter. So with, and I should also say that if you want to ask a question, that use the Q&A box. The panelists and the speakers will be monitoring that. They may reply in text, or we may save your question and come to those in the discussion time. And we hope to have discussion time at the end of the webinar, so you will have a chance to ask your questions or make comments. So I want to introduce our first speaker, who is Professor Margaret Sims. Margaret has recently retired, but like most academics, she's still working. She's an honorary professor of early childhood at Macquarie University. And perhaps most importantly, she has written a book called Bullshit Towers. And she has a long, she's done a lot of research in the area of neoliberalism and managerialism, but she's also been a very active national tertiary education union, the NTEU, the Australian University for Academics. And she served as branch president at the University of New England. She served 3 terms on the University Council, and she's also been a national councillor for the NTEU. So she has a really good insight into the impact of universities on people and the way that neoliberalism has affected them. So Margaret, without any further ado, I'd like to hand over to you. If you'd like to share your...
Thank you. Okay, let's go. So I'd like to acknowledge that I'm coming to you from Anowin land that is shared by the Dungari and the Kamilaroi, and pay my respects to Indigenous people, elders and emerging elders. So I guess in that I'm going first, I see that what I tried to develop in the book was some kind of model that used all the stuff that I'd learned over many, many years around how things impact children's development, to think about how we as academics are being impacted by the world in which we live in. And so I started off with this idea of neoliberalism and managerialism and the regulatory state. And that's the broader context in which we are working as universities in this country and in many other places around the world. And I really liked the idea of the bullshit language. If you do a Google Scholar search for bullshit, for example, it's a term that's being used more and more and more in the literature. In 6 months, there was something like 2,000 or 3,000 articles coming up using that search term bullshit. And I thought, it's time we brought that language and that thinking into this argument. So it seems to me that we have a context where these broader ideologies create a way of thinking and a way of talking about that thinking that I'm labeling bullshit. And I'm sure you've all seen it. I know that every time I used to get an email from anyone in management, I would kind of have to look at it for half an hour and maybe have a coffee before I could open it, because it seemed to me to be so full of this hot air these words that sounded beautiful, sounded lovely, but actually had no meaning. I mean, who's going to argue with concepts such as quality teaching and learning? Absolutely, I agree with it. But it gets lost in this bullshit language that when you actually try and probe and say, well, what does that actually mean? There's nothing underpinning it. So it seems to me that we've created this context where this bullshit language and bullshit thinking is what we are completely, in what we're completely immersed now. And you've really got to be critical to probe beneath the lovely sounding words and try and figure out what does it mean. I know one of the authors, and I can't remember off the top of my head, was talking about playing bullshit bingo. So that if you sat in a staff meeting, for example, and you had some key words like synergy and quality and flexibility and modern university, if you played bullshit bingo with those kinds of terms, you could probably win a fortune. But if you probe beneath what people mean when they talk about those things, there's very little meaning. So the way I saw this is that this kind of bullshit language and bullshit thinking shapes the figured world of the university in which we're working. And the particular features of that figured world that I wanted to address in the book was the idea of education as a product. It's a product that you sell. And in order to sell that product, you need to then create an image. Because why is a student going to buy your product versus someone else's product? So you get that idea of marketing. And if you look, for example, at the marketing budgets of universities over the last 10 years, most of them have more than doubled, if not quadrupled, in the money that is spent on marketing, because you're trying to sell this product that your university is producing and persuade students to buy that rather than someone else's product. And the minute you start getting into that kind of marketing way of thinking about the world, it also comes with standardization, because if you're selling a product, you need to be sure that whoever's buying this product gets the same as the person sitting next to them buying the same product. So standardization comes along with that way of thinking about the world. And that's associated with that perpetual competition. We can no longer work together. We're competing for students in the market. And as long as we're competing for students, I'm going to have to try and one-up you in order to get the student that you might have been trying to sign up. Part of this is also this management decision-making, this concept that management have the bigger picture. Management understand the world in which they're living. They understand the marketing imperative. And therefore, there's this tendency to stop listening to academics and to professional staff who are speaking about the reality of their day-to-day world, because management have these bigger views of the world that people working with students don't understand. So you get a major decline in democracy of the university. So those earlier days when someone like the Vice-Chancellor, for example, might have been elected out of the professoriate and paid a professorial salary with a minor supplement are long gone. Now, also part of this figured world is this idea that regulation and accountability determine quality. You cannot trust your academic staff to give you a quality teaching and learning experience for students. The way to ensure quality is to have this top-down control with regulation defining what you can and can't do, and really onerous accountability regimes for you to prove that you are doing what you are supposed to be doing. And so those are the features of the figured world in which we are then operating. Now, if you're working in a figured or living and working in a figured world with those characteristics, you create what I'm talking about in terms of management privilege. And management privilege is visible materially. So you can see that, just go around the offices, look at the different office space between the VC and the senior exec, and the senior managers and even your professors, and the visible difference in office space for the casuals who might do 99% of your marking. It's visible in status. It's visible in the creation of bullshit jobs. And I remember when UNE went through their restructure and we created faculties, whilst we had a staffing freeze, there were a whole pile of support jobs, professional staff support jobs that had to be put into the faculties so the faculties could work. And it seems that the status of a manager is often judged by the number of people reporting to that position. And so we have jobs being created that will support management. And certainly from my experience, there are a number of people in positions where I've thought I have absolutely no idea what those people do all day, because there's nothing that I can see that's any output of their work. And yet they're supported by a multitude of professional staff to do whatever it is they're doing, who knows. And this is emphasized by the suppression of student and staff voice, so that you get management talking about themselves as the university. So what we then have is that if we have this concept of management privilege, then there's a way that management need to behave to fit into that role of management. And so there's this creation of the privileged, or what I call the bullshitting script, which is the way that managers have to behave. And there's a lot of research around people, how they will adjust who they are and how they behave in order to fit in and be accepted. And I'm arguing that managers are in that same position, that if they wish to be successful as managers, if they wish to be accepted in their role and become part of the management club, then there are ways that they have to behave. And they have to follow that script. And if you don't follow that script, you soon find yourself not in a management role. And we see that in things like salary and title. So you see that the senior exec in most senior executive positions, even though they are professional roles, if you like, not academic roles, those people are given the title of professor, and they're given the salary of a CEO. And along with that goes the positioning of management is much more capable and important than staff, so that their job is more important. And you get this increasing isolation of management from staff. And there's a whole theory of management that suggests that it is much more effective to learn generic management skills and know nothing about the sector in which you're actually managing, because then you can make management decisions that are clear and not biased and not influenced by all the things that are happening in that sector. So that you have this isolation of management from staff. And I think that the current round of voluntary separation at UNE is a classic example where management decided that if you accepted voluntary separation, you had to leave by the end of December. UNE actually has a trimester system. So anyone who was teaching in trimester 3 either has to walk away in the middle of their teaching or refuse the voluntary separation, because management wouldn't budge from the set date that they had decided was relevant. So you get decisions that are made based on these generic management principles that have no understanding of the reality of the sector and where those principles are trying to be applied. And so quite often they don't make sense. And you'll get this deliberate use of bullshit languages and bullshit processes that actually, I argue, hide the lack of meaning and the lack of real contribution to the keyword of the university. If I hear another time that we need to have more redundancies to make the university more modern and flexible, I think I'm going to vomit, because what does that actually mean? What we also see is this creation of busy work for staff to minimize their ability to challenge, to engage in any kind of resistance. So that I just see staff so bogged under with so much they have to do that even the most appalling inequities just people are saying, I can't do it. I can't cope. I've got to do all this. I cannot do this other stuff. I cannot work casework for the union. I do not have time. Yes, I can see that these terrible things are happening to people, but I'm just so swamped, I can't deal with it. And I think that's quite deliberate. And along with that, we have bullying and micromanagement and the argument that these things are management prerogative. And I don't know how many cases I've fought where the most egregious decisions have been made that are clearly inequitable. And the argument has been, this is management prerogative to make that decision. It's management prerogative to give this person leave and not this person for no reason at all, just management prerogative. So what that means is that staff are operating in this bullshit figured world that shapes their experiences and shapes even the way they think about themselves. And this idea that this niceness and compliance are expected. You are expected to accept that someone 30 years younger than you and with a tenth of the experience of you can tell you what to do and expect you to say, yes, sir, I'll go and do it. That niceness and compliance is expected. And I thought it was really telling at one point at UNE after the voice survey identified how there were major problems with staff stress. The response to that was a whole pile of courses that people could go on that would teach them how to manage their stress and how to manage change. So the idea was, if you're feeling stressed in the workplace, that's your fault. And so you need to go and learn how to manage your stress so that you can fit in and do what is expected of you. And of course, all around people are these multiple examples of how conforming to bullshit is rewarded and challenging bullshit is not rewarded. So those who conform get promoted. And I've seen that again and again and again. There's also this idea of how people are expected to self-police their compliance so that you are responsible. If you're not feeling happy, that's your fault. What do you need to change in yourself to feel happy in the workplace where you are treated really badly? You need to learn to accept your reduction in agency, that deprofessionalization that has people telling you what to do and how to do it, and the positioning of educators as technicians so that you have standardized online sites and you must fit your stuff in there and you must record lectures and you must run lifetime tutorials because that's what teaching is. And no matter how much you show them the research that shows that that's not good online teaching, that's what's expected of you and you must do it. And of course, this whole intrusion of the online world into your home life so that you're getting emails sent in the middle of the night. Students are sending questions on the online site in the middle of the night. I had a student complain to me that, and put in a formal complaint, that a question lodged on the online site at 7 o'clock on Friday night was not answered by 9 o'clock on Monday morning. So there's this expectation that your work is 24/7. And people take on that self-image that complies with the bullshit, that people accept that that's how it is. And if they're not happy, it's their fault, that they need to work harder, they need to do more, rather than challenging the whole context that has set them up to feel like that. And I think that's probably my 15 minutes and I should stop and let someone else have a turn.
Thank you very much, Margaret. That I think will have resonated with many people who were listening today. So thanks, and thanks for putting that within that framework of how neoliberalism works. It's a very appropriate framework, I think. So now I'll introduce Andrew Miller, who's going to make a few comments. Andrew is our branch president of the NTEU at Flinders University, and he's been involved in many of the battles at Flinders University over various restructures over the last number of years. So thanks, Andrew, and over to you.
Thank you, Fran, and thank you, Margaret. I thoroughly endorse the book. It's a real powerful critique of all the various depravities and ills that are going on in our sector, and I believe everyone who's tuning in today will identify their institution in that book. A couple of things I do want to pick up on and amplify, which are outlined powerfully in the book, concern governance. One of the things that Margaret argues, and I think it's indisputable, and that is the shift from democracy to plutocracy or oligarchy in our universities. And this has happened, you know, across the board, not only in Australia, but overseas as well. And what that means is the systematic and deliberate alienation of staff and students from decision-making and governance. And we're seeing that through all sorts of levers. The obvious one in the first instance is the loss of staff and student voices on university councils, which is devastating to participation. The loss of voice and input and wisdom in change processes. We're seeing a perversion in terms like consultation, which management now mistakenly believes is only about notification rather than any kind of reciprocal, equitable dialogue between stakeholders. We're also seeing a wholesale erosion of collegiality and democratic processes and structures. And of course, we're seeing senior management quite literally behind locked doors and gated communities where you can't even get in to see them unless you're invited and the concierges allow you to enter. So they're literally divided from us. What this tells me is that across the board, we're getting something of a hostile corporate takeover of our public universities for private kind of economic kind of forces. And in these kinds of environments, staff and students are positioned as ignorant, naive, and or mischievous, and they need to be policed, audited, and surveilled. The other sort of outcome of this kind of governance structure, of course, is an attack on academic and intellectual freedom rights, because what's happening in the corporate managerialist university is management sees it as its rights to silence, dissent, and critique, rather than promote academic and intellectual freedom rights to speak. So it's the corporate imperative to silence anything that will challenge the reputation of the university rather than promoting genuine academic and intellectual freedom. Now, the repercussion of this, I believe, is that reflex, that critical, creative interjection into the commentary is being curtailed across the board in our sector. So most staff elect to not speak rather than cop the ramifications of the governance structure that I've just outlined, where the penalties are usually so severe. So what can we do about this? Now, Margaret talks late in the book about resisting bullshit, and I agree. And by that, Margaret means collective resistance, not individual resistance, because individual resistance is too easily shot down and curtailed. And to quote Margaret, she says, resistance must be based on hope that there is another way and that finding the other way is possible. And I think this is a really important point. No one will buy into collective resistance if they don't believe in a hopeful way forward. So I think that's really critical. And Margaret argues quite powerfully that we need to identify the gap between the rhetoric, aka bullshit, and reality. And we need to challenge and disrupt the post-truth bullshit that university managements are kind of peddling. And one way of doing that is to use a kind of collective reimagining or collective radical imagination to think about ways of framing the debate about a collective, socially just, public good university versus all those kind of neoliberal values that are usually bandied around. Now, where a union can be of help in this instance, I believe we need greater density of union membership in our universities if we've got any hope of collectively resisting these kinds of corporate trends. And one way the union can do this is through deep organising, and that is we need delegates on the ground everywhere so people feel close to each other so that they can actively stand together and resist these things, because otherwise, the way universities are structured today, we're divided and conquered against each other. So we do have to come together, we do have to resist collectively, and we need to forge those alliances together. Thank you, Fran. Thank you, Margaret.
Great, thank you very much, Andrew. That was brilliant. I particularly like the fact you brought in academic freedom and talked about the need for those critical voices and union membership as well. That's really important, and that's how we can make a change. Our next speaker is John Giardini. And John, I hope your video can come on. Yeah, there's John. Great, John. And I really was pleased that John accepted an invitation to speak at this seminar. I actually, he asked me to speak at the launch of his book recently, which was published by Wakefield Press and is called The Illusion of Evidence-Based Medicine. And John is a child psychiatrist who works at Adelaide University, where he heads up a critical and ethical mental health research group, which promotes safer, more effective and ethical research and practice in mental health. And I think particularly which argues for non-pathologizing approaches to mental health. And I was very taken by one of the chapters in his book, which was on academics and the corporate university. So I thought John could make a very real contribution to our discussions today by looking at how corporations are influencing the work that happens in our universities. So over to you, John.
Thanks very much, Fran. I'm privileged to be invited to be part of this, and thank you very much for Margaret for your address, some of which some of the issues you raised I'm going to touch on here. For properly functioning science, we need rigorous critical examination. We need scientists to take seriously the outcome of the severest possible testing of their hypotheses. But under the sponsorship of the pharmaceutical and medical device industries, academic medicine lacks that quality. Karl Popper's perhaps an unexpected ally against neoliberalism in academia, but an entirely expected critic of bullshit. He wrote about his concerns about the stagnating effects of, quote, the unchecked growth of big science, which endangers great science. It's no surprise that the pharmaceutical industry gives priority to its responsibility to shareholders over scientific integrity. Of much more concern is the way in which universities, supposedly the supporters of scientific integrity, become entangled with business and compromise basic academic values in the way that Margaret outlined. We've heard about decreased government funding, increased competition for students, and legislation. There's also legislation that supports industry partnerships and the subsequent embrace of a neoliberal market role for themselves, seemingly unconcerned that they thereby become instruments of industry. So if we look at Harvard University's Faculty of Medicine policy on conflicts of interest, as recently as May of 2016, they say, we're working in a global age of discovery. To be competitive both financially and intellectually, bridging disciplines and industries is key. The university applauds the creative ways in which our faculty foster relationships with companies that work to commercialize innovation and bring therapies to patients. And here's what I think is the key point. Conflicts generally are positive indicators that our faculty members are recognized thought leaders who have professional opportunities, government funding, and support from the companies working to translate research into the bedside. It really suits universities to frame these relationships with industries as partnerships, but this shows a disingenuous failure to recognize the asymmetry of these relationships. I'll say more about that later. In my field, the short-term stimulus to biomedical research by privatization has been much celebrated, but the unintended long-term consequences for medicine have been severe. And overall, scientific progress is thwarted by the ownership of knowledge. In clinical medicine, the adverse impact on the research agenda is not just wasteful, it costs lives. The corruption of the research agenda, as Popper concludes, too many dollars chasing too few ideas. So the whole concept of billions of dollars being spent and made on the creation of Me Too drugs that don't represent any real innovation. Less than 10% of new drugs coming onto the market represent a significant advance over what's already available. And there's much more energy and money going into drugs that treat heartburn, hair loss, and sexual performance on the one hand, or exorbitant niche drugs for cancer and other rare diseases on the other, both with enormous profits to companies, while less profitable medicines for serious life-threatening diseases are not developed or not equitably distributed or are discontinued. And just a side note about Pfizer, who are proudly giving us a vaccine against COVID, they already have a vaccine against pneumococcal disease, which nevertheless kills 300,000 children a year in India who remain unvaccinated, while Pfizer makes billions of dollars profit from that product. Many of you will be aware of the problems of ghostwriting. Lehman McHenry, the co-author of The Illusion of Evidence-Based Medicine, and I had privileged access to internal documents from GlaxoSmithKline's paroxetine study 329 and Forest Laboratories' citalopram study 18, both of antidepressants in adolescents and children. Now, those studies resulted in influential ghostwritten publications that contributed strongly to increased antidepressant prescribing for children and adolescents, yet both seriously misrepresented efficacy and safety data. It's indicative of the cynicism with which ghostwriting is conducted that the ghostwriter of the citalopram study wrote to her contact at Forest. She wrote, "I don't know that any decision's been made about who's going to write the manuscript." And she then parenthesizes, "not to be confused with who's going to be the author of the manuscript, which also isn't decided as far as I know." Now that author turned out to be Karen Wagner, but we know from subsequent correspondence that a full draft of the published paper was prepared by the Medical Communications Company and extensively circulated around Forest Pharmaceuticals' marketing department before Dr. Wagner ever saw it. And I don't know much about Dr. Wagner's university career, but she did go on to become president of the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, which is the most powerful advocacy group in the US and therefore probably in the world. Now, ghostwriting's been defended on the grounds that busy scientists who aren't necessarily good writers are freed up to concentrate on what they do best, while the scientific writer, which is the euphemism for a ghostwriter, prepares the paper. Now, from an academic perspective, that constitutes plagiarism and cheating in career advancement. But there are more important reasons to be concerned about ghostwriting, because ghostwriting is part of a broader ghost management of research. And in many cases in medicine, the whole process of research, publication, and education, apparently carried out by university academics, is in fact ghost managed by industry. And much of this is achieved through the grooming, promotion, and management of key opinion leaders, a term used in industry to describe the most influential of academics. So in my field of medicine, sales representatives are the key people to identify potential key opinion leaders. And the ideal is a bright, ambitious, charismatic young doctor who's affiliated with a prestigious university and whose views are already sympathetic to the company's agenda. That key opinion leader is then groomed by being given support for research. As you'll all be aware, funding from major funding bodies is very hard to come by. For doctors and medical scientists, to a lesser extent, funding from industry is there for the asking. So the key opinion leader is groomed through getting that support for research, given teaching opportunities, given positions on advisory boards. And as Sergio Sismondo, who's written a lot about key opinion leaders, notes, repeatedly being billed as a leading expert can give the person a status of leading expert. Sismondo characterizes unkindly, but I think accurately, key opinion leaders as zombies, animated bodies sent out to do farmers' bidding. And the best key opinion leaders are those who are unaware that they're anyone's creation, They're mostly proud of the way that they make use of industry without any impact on their own ideas. And the process is demeaning to both parties. Sismondo reports, the reps laughed amongst themselves. They say, the most comical thing is doctors' attitudes. You'll never hear a physician say this is influencing me. They're just so arrogant and naive. So the biggest trick of industry is to take away agency from someone who nevertheless gets the impression that their agency has been increased. And so you can readily appreciate that a key opinion leader speaking with personal conviction about a drug will be a much more powerful marketing tool than someone who's overtly identified as a marketing representative. And no one is as vulnerable as the academic who doesn't appreciate the controlling hand of industry. They may recognise they've got a debt to industry, but what they characteristically don't realise is that they're paying it off with interest. Ironically, the industry-sponsored key opinion leaders seem to enjoy many advantages of academic freedom because they are supported by their universities as well as the industry and journal editors in the expression of their views, even when those views are incongruent with the real evidence. So the misrepresentations, and we've made countless attempts to have misrepresented articles withdrawn from the literature with little or no success. And universities have been singularly unsupportive in this process, seeming to fear the possibility of litigation. So critics of industry face rejections from journal editors, legal threats, and potential destruction of their careers, in many cases by their own universities. And so sometimes academic investigators, Nancy Oliveri is a famous example that you may have heard of, they blow the whistle on the misrepresentation of scientific data. There are ghostwriters who've come out about their pressure to position drugs with favourable marketing messages. There are even regulators who stand up against approvals of drugs that haven't been demonstrated to be safe and effective. But more often than not, these whistleblowers do so at the cost of their careers and their personal lives to a certain extent. And that uneven playing field is exactly what concerned Popper when he wrote about suppression and control of the means of science communication through corporate and political power. I'd like to just talk about an experience of my own university and an American one, seeming not to give priority to the proper disclosure of data that have significant impact on the safety of millions of patients. Natalie Abou-State is leading our team, which is reanalyzing the treatment for adolescents with depression study, so-called TADS, which was funded by the US NIMH many years ago. TADS has been highly influential with many key papers cited hundreds of times, generally uncritically, and the findings have influenced clinical treatment guidelines in many countries, establishing the combination of the antidepressant drug fluoxetine or Prozac and cognitive behavioural therapy or CBT as gold standard treatments for depression. Now, all drug trials measure adverse events, and most important among the adverse events are what are called serious adverse events, which are events that result in hospitalisation or other serious outcomes. And serious adverse events that occurred in TADS have never been properly reported. The original TADS investigators have published over 48 papers, but none of these contain a summary of the serious adverse events that occurred during the study. Now, as part of our research, we've been granted access to TADS databases deposited with NIMH, and that indicates that 66 serious adverse events were recorded during the study, with 30 occurring during the 12-week acute phase, which we're reanalyzing. Data from the NIMH don't include adverse event narratives, which we've previously demonstrated to be essential for rigorous reanalysis. We therefore approached Duke University, where the coordinating centre team for TADS was based, and the current PI, John Curry, reported that most clinical report forms have been destroyed in 2017 in accordance with Duke's document retention policies, but that fortunately the serious adverse event forms were intact. We therefore requested them suitably de-identified, and after haggling over the high price they were demanding, we executed a data use agreement with Duke. But nearly 2 months later, Duke withdrew its agreement to release those forms, stating that the narratives contained information that was too idiographic to be sufficiently de-identified. Now, their response was totally inconsistent with their provision of patient-level data to Columbia University some years previously, and we thought Duke's response placed them in breach of our data use agreement, and we sought and were declined support from our institution, the University of Adelaide, to challenge that decision. We then sought independent legal advice from a US law firm, Baum Hedlund, and a declaration of interest here. I've done consultative work for Baum Hedlund. They advised us that Duke's stance was invalid for a number of reasons, including their suggestion that the adverse event forms were not able to be identified was disingenuous, and that our team had NIMH approval to access TAD's data. We passed on to our university legal department an offer from Baum Hedlund to pursue the data on our behalf. I don't have permission to report our university's response on the grounds that it might compromise legal professional privilege. Absent the availability of data from Duke in the interest of patient safety, we've energetically pursued other sources of information about serious adverse events, including the FDA, the company that provided the medication and who the researchers were obliged to report serious adverse events to, that's Lilly, and Columbia University. Lilly have withheld their data, they deny having it. The FDA is not facilitating the timely provision of data or even not telling us whether they have it. And our own university hasn't supported us taking further steps to obtain the data. So we think that Duke's poorly constructed arguments around participant confidentiality, which we affirm has never been breached, don't stand up against the ethical and moral responsibility to the millions of children prescribed fluoxetine since 2004, influenced by TADS and the characterization of antidepressants in clinical practice guidelines as gold standard treatment for adolescent depression. I just wanted to close by making a couple of comments about managerialism. I think that universities become businesses and students become consumers is not just due to financial considerations. It's also in response to centuries of elitism. But I think the resultant managerialism of the corporate university compromises, as Margaret's pointed out, the very concept of academic leadership. And that's no longer meaningful at most of our institutions. Deans who reach their leadership positions by virtue of distinguished contributions to their disciplines have been replaced with fundraisers and academic managers. And disciplines at the heart of the university have been wholly compromised, especially when forced to demonstrate their profitability or to show how they can attract corporate sponsors. And it seems to me that elitism might be a lesser evil than managerialism. I said at the start that pharmaceutical companies are orders of magnitude bigger than universities and have the power, resources, and expertise to steer the partnership in a way that suits them, so that universities come to serve as agents for the promotion of commercial products. And there are probably people in the audience who are better equipped than me to argue this, but it feels to me that there can never be a partnership between the very rich and the relatively poor. Universities, if they're going to engage with industry, I would argue need to do that on some kind of fee-for-service basis, where it's really clear what industry is buying from the university and it's really clear what the university is selling. In that way, although the relationship is still unequal, that at least the university has some hope of maintaining its integrity and the integrity of science that's carried out by that university. it's hard to understand the failure of intelligent, well-educated academics to recognise that if something's too good to be true, it probably isn't. Key opinion leaders and academic leaders manage to turn a blind eye to the ways in which they're being exploited. As the late Mickey Nardo, better known as One Boring Old Man, wrote, "It's always funny when small children try to play hide and go seek by covering their eyes, but when grown-ups do it, it loses its charm." Thank you.
Thank you, John. That was a fantastic but very worrying analysis of how corporations are infiltrating our university. And I noticed in chat, Maureen Dollard commented that it's happening with the military, the defence industry too. Certainly that's the case in our own state of South Australia. And some of our research we've done on transnational corporations at Southgate, led by Julia Anaf, has looked at the role of sponsorship for the fossil fuel industry and various sponsorship of research units and so on. So I was thinking that what you talked about was the infiltration of the university, but it really was corporations sort of falling into the welcome arms of the corporations falling into the welcome arms of the university. And I'm now going to introduce Jenny Poppe, who's going to act as a discussant on John's talk. And Jenny and I are research collaborators, and I think because we get on well, she agreed to get up at 5 o'clock this morning to join this seminar. And Jenny is a sociologist, one of the leading researchers in the UK on health inequities. But another thing she's been very much looking at is, of course, evidence-based medicine through the use of qualitative research particularly. So I think Jenny has worked a lot in health and medicine, so I'll be in a good position to comment on John's talk. So over to you, Jenny.
Okay, thanks very much, Fran. And yes, good morning from the north of England here. That was a really stimulating, powerful indictment of what's going on in the world of evidence-based medicine, John, and difficult to follow, really, I think. But I wanted to make just 3 or 4 points that I think arise from the example you've given of this, the dark arts, really, of the pharmaceutical industry. Maybe falling into the arms of the universities, maybe I think taking over. Certainly there's an argument developing now about how corporations are becoming entangled with our governments as well. So I think it's a kind of example of a wider tendency that's going on. So the first issue I wanted to raise really was, I haven't read your whole book. Of course, reading books is becoming difficult for us academics, isn't it, really? So, but I have read quite a lot of it, and I've thought it was so thought-provoking. But one of the issues it raised for me was the issue of intentionality, of kind of responsibility and accountability. So there's a sense of my experience of the evidence-based movement, particularly through the Cochrane collaboration, which is this international movement most people, I presume, will know, synthesizing evidence across multiple studies, that many of the academics working in evidence-based medicine, they don't seem to appreciate the way in which these dark arts are operating, really. And I think a couple of years ago, there was a crisis in Cochrane. Some people may remember this. The International Board of Cochrane kicked out one of the members, the head of the Nordic Cochrane Centre, who is a very internationally recognized critic of the role of industry in research, particularly pharmaceutical industry in research, and the implications of that for the way in which Cochrane does its systematic reviews. And it's quite a profound critique of Cochrane, really. And it opened up a crack, an opportunity for debate about what Cochrane were doing, and the way in which the evidence they were working with was potentially very, very seriously tainted. But it got closed down very quickly. It got closed down very quickly. And I think it's interesting to know why it got closed down, or to understand a bit better why it got closed down. But I personally think one of the reasons is the extraordinary naivety of many of the disciples of evidence-based medicine. It's like a religious movement, in part, evidence-based medicine. And Trish Greenhush, who is an enormous, I respect her enormously, professor of primary care at Oxford University, actually wrote a editorial at the time in the BMJ arguing that we needed to cut Cochrane some slack while they sorted out these problems which were not a crisis. So I think there's some need for more exploration of the accountability, intentionality of people working within the evidence-based movement who have the best of intentions, but I think are colluding, unknowingly maybe, but they are being manipulated really by this powerful engine that you describe in your book, John. So that's one really critical issue for me. And the other is that there are actually a fair number of academics who know absolutely what they're doing, who completely understand what's happening, who are not naive, and who buy into this commodification of knowledge. And I think your book makes that very clear. And as does books like Ben Goodacre's Bad Pharma makes it very clear as well. And so the doctors, institutionally and individually, patients, institutionally and individually, are taking the money knowingly, and they're taking the favors knowingly. And so again, I think that's a question of intentionality and accountability, but it's kind of, we're not allowed to talk it. There's a really powerful narrative against talking about that within medicine, within healthcare. So I think we really do need to address this issue of intentionality and accountability within the evidence-based movement. I suppose, I believe, I hope that the majority are the naive rather than the colluders. But that's the hope, I think, and that Andrew was saying. You know, if you're going to do collective action to change things, then you have to have some hope of a better future. So I think most people in evidence-based medicine are doing it with the best of intentions, but they need to understand more what's going on. But I'd be interested in other people's comments on that. So what is this alternative really for the public university? There's a very interesting, if anybody wants to read a short piece, in an American news sheet that I haven't seen before, called National Affairs. It was just published by Perrison and Riley, and they're arguing that we need to reimagine the public university. Well, it's fascinating reimagining framework that they come up with. So their framework is cut administrative costs, change the teaching model, which is really Margaret's argument and Andrew's about, you know, customer focused, cut departments, especially in the humanities and the social sciences, because apparently we contribute to the excessive administrative costs and we offer little value, a key issue, I think, in relation to what John's arguing, and then give low-income students vouchers. So if that's one model that is now a very powerful model of the new public university, within which, of course, your evidence-based medicine account fits perfectly, really. So it seems to me we need to be thinking very clearly about what is the alternative model here. As the point about this seminar, what is the future for the public university if it isn't to be this kind of future with John's evidence-based medicine, not an illusion, a reality, that reality becoming widespread across many disciplines, particularly those disciplines that can turn their knowledge into economic assets, which of course is a challenge for social sciences and humanities, although I have to say that the behavioral scientists are doing very well at that at the moment. So to do that, to come up, I think, with an alternative, a different kind of evidence-based medicine, one that is more inclusive of the kind of knowledge that's allowed in, one that is more independent of for-profit driven evidence makers. I think we kind of need to understand the nature of the challenge. And here I think Michael Burraway's, the sociologist at Berkeley, I think he still is. I think his argument that what this is all about really is a struggle over who owns the knowledge, who owns knowledge really, and who commands what knowledge is used for. And I think that was any reading of the principles of the public university includes the idea of the university as a critic as the conscience of society, not the only one, but one of them, that is using knowledge, not as a means to achieve specific ends, which is what is happening in the kind of evidence-based medicine monster that John is describing, but as a vehicle for critiquing and thinking about those ends. Are those the ends we want as a society, really? So I think at the core of all of this, for me, is that to challenge the kind of model of evidence-based medicine, evidence-based education, evidence-based social policy, evidence-based justice, which is all at the moment being entangled with this corporate model that you've laid out for medicine in particular. We have to think about this issue as a struggle about knowledge, really, a struggle about the ownership of knowledge. Because unless we do that, I think we're kind of we're in danger of fighting the wrong battle if we don't have the right kind of analysis of the problem, I think. I hope I've been reasonably intelligent for 6:30 in the morning. But I think what we need to do is think about that, think about if knowledge is at the heart of this, if the role of the university as a critic and a conscience of society is what we want the public universities to be, then how do we achieve that? What do we need to do to get a better understanding of the way forward from that kind of starting point?
That's fantastic, Jenny. Thank you very much. And I realise my problem in my academic career is we have to be able to turn our knowledge into money-making enterprises. And when you research social determinants of health, that doesn't really happen. So yeah. Thank you very much for your thoughts. There's some great comments coming up in the notes as well. And I think, you know, many, or I should suspect most people on this call would agree that universities should be offering a critique of society and reflecting some of the inequities in society and how we might do something about those. So thanks for highlighting those. So now I'd like to introduce our third speaker, Associate Professor Nick Taylor, who teaches human services and social work at the University of Canterbury in New Zealand, and who is a critical and public sociologist. And she does research on the mechanisms of power and how marginalisation happens, and particularly looks at human relations with other species. Her work is informed by a critical intersectional feminism, and she also says she writes about the horrors of neoliberal violence. So over to you, Nick.
Thank you. Kia ora koutou. Hello, everybody. I'm just going to share my screen because I need a PowerPoint to keep me on track here because there's so much to say. All right, hopefully we're good and you can see that. I'm going to try and stick to the 20 minutes here, so I'll just start a clock. The reason I'm doing this is I'm so angry about all of this that I don't know when to stop talking. So I'm going to talk to you today about my main argument, which picks up on everything. Sorry, I should just step back. Thank you very much for the invitation to speak, and thanks to the other panelists. I think there's some really interesting and important stuff being raised here. And as I'm going to argue at the end, I think that keeping these kind of spaces to have these kind of conversations is incredibly important right now. So I'm going to start backwards here. And the summary of my argument is going to be that there's a need for an intersectional feminist response to neoliberalism in the university sector. I know that the F word might put a lot of people off. But I will explain why I think this is ultimately a feminist response that we need. My main arguments are that it challenges a masculinist status quo, which is also a very westernized status quo. So things like that we've heard from previous speakers around how competition becomes our day-to-day normality. And instead, I would argue that we need collaboration. I believe firmly, as I'm sure that so many of you do, that we need to move the university from being seen as a private service to being a public good. I think it needs to be based on the idea of social justice principles, whether or not they're evidence-based. And I think we need to reclaim the idea of the university as a space that produces knowledge for the people rather than knowledge for administrators or knowledge for profit. So the impacts of market universities are really broad. Obviously, it impacts our students. I think our students are actually allies in this struggle. I think they are tired of being seen as clients. Their morale is sinking. They pick up on our morale as well, which is dreadful right now. Their mental health is awful. Students are seeking mental health help at university campuses in numbers that are unprecedented. So clearly something is affecting them. And if it's not necessarily that they're picking up on our morale, then it's definitely the expectations that we have of them, where we cram massive numbers into these courses and expect them to manage all this while paying fees and while working 2, 3, 4 other jobs. I think they're also fed up with superficial learning. I think that a lot of what we have to do in order to manage what we do on a day-to-day basis as staff means that often they don't get this kind of deep critical research or thinking or teaching that they want. So I think there's an impact on students, which I'm not going to dwell on. I just wanted to make it clear that, you know, everybody is affected here. There's an impact on staff. And when I'm talking about staff here, I'm talking about professional staff as well as academic staff. And again, I think that professional staff and academic staff are allies in this struggle. I think professional staff are pretty fed up as well. Most of the cuts at the universities that I've worked at seem to take their toll on professional staff first and then move to academic staff. I think for all of us, but particularly for academic staff, you know, the morale, most of us are struggling. We're angry or we're depressed, we can't get out of bed, or we want to do some harm to people. It seems to be that we go from one extreme to the other. We've got a loss of voice, we've got a loss of autonomy. Andrew spoke about this around the shrinking of councils that mean that we can't be heard. Our health is suffering as well. Mental health, depression, suicide is rampant within the sector. And a lot of that is to do with the security or lack of it and the precarity that we are living with and that particularly casual staff are living with. And then, as I'm going to get to later, there are questions around our own complicity in the neoliberal university that I think are really hard. I don't know about you, but I find it exhausting constantly watching myself just being vigilant for my own complicity. And of course, I have to be complicit at times. I can't resist all of the time, or else, well, I'd be out of a job for a start, but I just don't have that kind of energy. And I know this isn't me, just me. I know that everybody else is feeling very similarly. And in 2017, with Heather Fraser from QUT in Australia, we did a survey around teaching controversial issues. It was in human animal studies, our particular areas. And we asked people what it's like teaching controversial or critical issues in the neoliberal university. And as you can imagine, we got a deluge of responses saying it's really hard. And so I've taken some of these quotes throughout these slides as we're going. And I wanted to pick up on the idea that no one talks truthfully anymore, and also pick up on the idea that Margaret talked about, that if you do talk truthfully, if you speak truth to bullshit, as it were, then you are labelled as unruly or as the hooligan in the hallway. You are the one who becomes to blame, and you are closed out. And again, that shuts down our voices. It makes it more and more difficult for us to speak. The increased casualisation makes this all so much worse. We can't ask or expect casuals to speak up when they know that they will lose their jobs for doing so. So all of this is very deliberate. I think they're very deliberate strategies on behalf of management. And slowly but surely, I think the base of what the higher education sector is for is being eroded. I think the third area that this impacts is research. As I'm sure you will all be so aware of, there are various measures that direct our research trajectories. And research is, I want to say, increasingly politicised, but I'm not sure that it's ever been depoliticised. But these measures include increasing metricization. I don't know what countries you're from, but you will have terminology like a Q1 journal or a Scopus journal or an A-star journal, whatever it is, that you're expected to publish in, irrespective of whether that's the right audience for your particular message. We're also expected to get grants. And both of these things are tied into our performance reviews and any aspirations we may have for promotion, which essentially corrals us into doing these things. We can choose not to, for sure, but we won't get promoted and we may well lose our jobs. And all of this kind of, I don't know about you, but it feels to me increasingly claustrophobic. Like I can't breathe, you know, like all of these things are going on around me and I need to find a way through them. And find a way to use the anger that they generate in me to push back against them. I also think there's an issue of inclusion. I think as universities restructure again and again and again, that, you know, we talk about research clusters or research themes or whatever the terminology is. And if you aren't doing the Q1 journals and you aren't getting the grants, you get excluded from those research clusters, which again takes away your voice, but also threatens your livelihood. And I think that overall, these are effects that that we have on research. That neoliberalism has on both research and teaching. I think there's a push towards conservatism. I think that those of us who work at the margins in critical research, so I do research that comes out of feminism that looks at human-animal relationships, and you can probably imagine how well that goes over in the current academy. So there's a push towards conservatism. I've been counselled away from this area of research by mentors, told if I want promotions, then, you know, move away from it, do something else. And that means that there's a push towards research that supports the status quo. I strongly suspect that a feminist-informed critical animal studies piece of work is not high on the list of a government grant. So if I want to play the game, then I need to have a think about how I position myself and how I position my research. And very often that means you don't do certain things. I think this bleeds over into teaching. So we're increasingly taught, we're increasingly given the message that our students are clients, that it's pay as you go, that they are expecting a good service from us, and therefore that we should not cause offence. And this issue of offence, I think, is a very neoliberal one. It's very difficult to teach, let's say, for example, a feminist perspective on meat eating without causing offence. How do I do that? And so, you know, and I think, and not just for my examples, but I think teaching anything that asks people to look at their base ideas, you can't do that without causing offence. It's uncomfortable for students, and it should be. And it should be dealt with in a good way, but we should be making them have some sense of discomfort that causes them to critically reflect on their beliefs. And doing that in the neoliberal university is very difficult when they complain and the management upholds that complaint against you. All of this, as well as many other things, I think lead to the creation and maintenance of a culture of fear. And that culture of fear leads us to do things that we wouldn't normally do. So I'll give you an example that's been happening recently throughout Australia. I think that COVID has played into the hands of a lot of VCs who want to make changes, and they're doing so under this kind of disaster capitalism, as Naomi Klein calls it. And they've reached out to staff and said, what do you think that we should do to manage our budgets? And because we care deeply about our colleagues and we care deeply about education, we've put forward ideas, and those ideas are horrific. You know, they teach 18 hours a day, teach 7 days a week, teach for less pay, research for less pay, give up research, only teach. All of these ideas are put forward by well-meaning academics that then I think vice chancellors can take and run with, and then turn around when we complain and say this is awful and say, well, they were your ideas. And all of this comes out of a culture of fear. We're scared for our jobs. We're scared for the future of the sector. And that makes us put forward these kind of ideas. And as you can see from this quote here, we're also scared of speaking our mind, talking about our research in honest ways, talking about it with students for fear of these complaints. Now, if we follow this, then I think what it leads to is exclusion. If we go for those mainstream grants and we go for that conservative research agenda, then significant groups of our society are excluded. So those who can't pay, those who can't chip in to grants, for example, I do a lot of work in the domestic violence sector, there's no money. They can't put a great deal of money into grants, which means things like linkage grants are a no-go. Also, those people, those beings who are deemed useless in neoliberal contexts. Why would our universities that are inherently neoliberal support research into aspects of society that they don't want to think about? So welfare recipients, the elderly, other species, the environment, the list goes on. My point being that those who are already at the margins of society are the ones who are most affected by this push towards conservatism in our research. In teaching, I think it's very similar, but I think what we're seeing is a return to class privilege. And I've put a question mark there because I'm not sure that class privilege ever left the academy. I'm a working class woman. I can tell you I feel very working class at times. And it maintains the status quo. We're not offering any kind of critical evaluation of the loss of democracy. Now, it's easy to get mired in the misery of all of this, and believe me, I have my days where I am. But I think that we need to start thinking, how do we push through this? How do we push back? I was talking to a colleague and a friend the other day and saying, you know, it's awful right now in the academy, it's terrible, but we are all still here. And we are all still here because we care passionately. We think that education, critical education, and public education is crucial to our democratic societies. And so we're all still here. So we've got to find a way through this. And here are some ideas from our survey respondents. We need to keep teaching our critical thinking because that's key to social change. We can find ways to just be quiet in some respects, keep our head down, allow management to just let you get on with it. That's not always possible, but it is possible sometimes, and you always need a breather, so that can be a strategy. And unions, as Andrew said, I think we need collective behaviour, collective push, collective power here. In terms of how this links to research, I think that all of this should inform the kind of research that we do. I think that our research should be framed in terms of resisting neoliberal imperatives to ignore, silence and marginalise. I realise that this might be discipline specific, or at least topic specific, but I think those of us who choose to work with marginalised groups and who choose to use our research to advocate with and for marginalised groups, we need to be aware of all of these neoliberal imperatives, and we need to keep pushing back through the research that we do. We need to be aware that universities don't necessarily support our research, but then all of a sudden, if our research looks interesting, they will take it because it can be framed as noble. And in some respects, I think we need to resist that too. I don't know about you, but I don't want my research being rewritten by my university's media department in order to be put on the front of glossy magazines to sell the very thing that I think they shouldn't be selling. So we need to be mindful of this too. I think we also need to be mindful, as Jenny was saying, about the politics of knowledge production. When we choose what research we want to do, we are making decisions about the politics of knowledge production. So we need to think carefully about what kinds of research we think are worthwhile, not what management thinks are worthwhile, not what grant bodies think are worthwhile, but what we think are worthwhile. And we want to get out there and ask our communities what kinds of research they think is worthwhile too. And that leads to questions around research. Who do we do our research with? Who do we do our research for? And on which topics? Now, all of this sounds wonderful, but it doesn't come without risk. One of the biggest questions for me is, how do we negotiate this? How do we actually do this on a day-to-day basis? And as I mentioned earlier, how do we manage this sense of complicity or resistance? And I'm going to come to some solutions in a minute. I'm just going to list the risks. I think there are personal risks, mental health. I think there are professional risks too. You know, we're marginalised, we're excluded. We don't get promoted as quickly, we may lose our jobs, whatever it is. I think that we are increasingly marginalised if we speak out. And if we speak out through our research with these kind of populations, then again, I think we're marginalised. I think if we adopt a critical position, then generally speaking, the university doesn't want to hear about it. I also think it gives ammunition to detractors. So there's this kind of idea that what we might do isn't proper scholarship, that if you are an advocate as a scholar, then somehow you are biased or tainted, you're not neutral. And of course, we have oodles of research over decades showing that neutrality is an image that we've constructed ourselves. It doesn't really exist in research. But this kind of idea that it isn't proper scholarship attempts to steer us towards proper research. But I think all of these things that are bubbling around us mean that it's more important than ever that we remain committed to social justice research as a counter to this. We keep doing what we know is the right thing to do. We need to do that with clarity around our own position and motivation. And we also, well, I don't know about you, but I've had to learn which battles to fight. So some kind of practical ideas here, as I've said, commit to social justice approaches. And this just isn't just ideological. You know, we need to commit to this methodologically. We need to work with Indigenous groups. We need to work with groups who are advocating for the environment or for animal rights or for other marginalised groups or beings. I think we need to ground this in a deep respect of our intellectual legacies. It's all too tempting in the modern university to proclaim that you found something new. You haven't. You know, you're standing on the shoulders of other people. We need to own our political position and be out there and be proud where we can. This may not be doable for people in precarious positions, but then those of us who have senior positions, I think there's more pressure on us to do that. I think we need to develop inclusive methods in our research. As I said, we need to talk to communities and work out what needs doing. You know, what we think needs doing from our privileged status isn't necessarily what they think needs doing. I think we need to use our power and privileged position to do something. Just, it makes you feel better. You might achieve something. We can do something for the communities that we research with. We can do something within our institutions to push back against neoliberal frameworks. I think we need to make allies and protect radical spaces. Just like this, we need to have honest conversations. We need to work with and for advocates and activists across society. I think we need to model inclusive and critical approaches for students. I think talk to them about this stuff. I think try not to be scared. When I talk to I do a lecture on neoliberal education, and I talk to students about the bullshit that we're dealing with, and they love it. I get so many emails from them about how refreshing it is to hear this. And finally, I think we need to be advocates. Some of us may want to be activists too, but we need to be advocates for social justice, for the education, commit to public dissemination rather than just sticking to our Q1 journals that may get us our promotion. And we need to challenge the status quo in our scholarship and in our institutions. And I think that should give us hope around the future, because at the end of the day, I think what we need to remember is this is our sector. This is ours, it's not theirs. And we can reclaim this if we just keep finding ways to survive. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Nick. That was brilliant. It was really good. And I love your use of dogs in the PowerPoint as a fellow.
Thank you.
And you just made some really fantastic points. And I love the positive examples at the end of what we can do. That's really helpful. And I think maybe otherwise everybody was getting a bit depressed. So it was really good to look at the action. I think, I forget who said it, but the situation is impossible and we must take the next step. And it was great to have those extra next steps listed. So the person I'm going to introduce as the panelist is Sam Schultz, who's a fellow academic at Flinders University in Sociology of Education. And Sam, this webinar started with a coffee that Sam, I and another colleague, Colin McDougall, had some 6 months ago.
Yeah.
So thanks, Sam, for her role in planning and bringing this, thinking through who we would ask to be on this webinar. And I'll hand over to you, Sam, to give some discussion on Nick's presentation.
Thanks so much, Fran, and thanks, Nick. I hope everyone can hear me. I've got my little headpiece on. In the time that I have, I want to distill some key ideas from Nick's book, which resonate with today's presentation before connecting your work with the key provocation of this webinar. So in your book, you don't just tell us, but show us that neoliberalism is a pernicious, individualizing force that has steadily colonized virtually all aspects of our working lives, and that it's insidious in the sense that it is incremental. You make clear that what is at stake here, and others have made this point, is knowledge itself. We need only look to the United States right now to appreciate that the social costs of non-critical knowledge circulation amidst the rise of anti-intellectualism. So knowledge is important. The way that it's produced, circulated, validated, or silenced by our major institutions is key. As you point out, universities are one of the last remaining places where noisy conversations about democracy can take place. So to suppress this function has real world impacts. So you say, Nick, that we must develop consciousness and share consciousness of how research, funding and publication regulations in our unis are being deeply enmeshed in neoliberalism. Under these conditions, it has become harder to pursue research that doesn't speak to the needs of industry. And you provide an example from your own experience where research designed to improve the productivity of the heavily male-dominated agribusiness sector tends to attract funding, while work that problematizes the use of animals, their slavery and exploitation, tends not. So put simply, we know that decontextualized positivist research that serves industry imperatives is often favored by neoliberal universities, while qualitative research that raises critical consciousness is often silenced. But your work also shows us that this research, critical research, is an incisive tool for challenging neoliberalism. You provide an example, which I want to share, of how qualitative research, and I'm going to use this term loosely, can also be decontextualized when used for neoliberal ends. And this example might seem benign, but it is precisely the kind of thing that we can be having noisy conversations about. So you talk about a qualitative survey that might ask 500 students whether they would like the shopping precinct on campus to be upgraded. So space is made in the survey for respondents to identify their wish list of shops to be included. And while this might seem a simple attempt to ensure that the university responds to student needs, it also constitutes the student as a consumer, which leads to social agency being defined in market terms. It does so using the language of choice and responsiveness, which gives a false sense of empowerment. Students might feel empowered, but overlooked here is any critical debate about the assumption that students are merely consumers, or about what has been bracketed from view in this research-driven construction of choice. So this is one example of the insidious ways that knowledge is being curtailed, decontextualized and sanitized. It's just a survey, we might say, but you ask, Nick, what might the university look like if students were asked whether they would prefer tens of millions of dollars or pounds to be spent upgrading the shopping precinct, or if that money were dedicated to delivering classes or providing scholarships to refugee and poor students who are increasingly frozen out of the sector. So these are crucial questions about the ways in which public money is being used under the neoliberal guise of choice. And on this point, owing to the economic impacts of COVID, female enrolment in Australian universities has dropped by around 86,000 this year because we're seeing a pink recession. Just like animals, many of whom, as you show us, Nick, live in slavery and abject misery owing to human exploitation, the gendered as well as race and class nature of the neoliberal impacts on our lives can be easily ignored by neoliberal universities that do not care about these things, let alone the lives of animals. But you don't leave us without hope, and you didn't in today's talk. Just as neoliberal transformations have occurred incrementally for the most part, so too can resistance and refusal. You talk about refusing to depoliticise our curriculum content, standing in solidarity with casual staff, remembering the promise of critical research, engaging in collective slow research, which isn't just about making individual lives better, but about remaking the university. So what future do public universities have? I think that your work shows they must have a future. We must do what we can collectively to amplify their public accountabilities. And if Ruth Bader Ginsburg was correct, change in society is incremental. Enduring change happens one step at a time. So thank you again, Nick, for showing us some of those steps.
Thanks, Sam.
Fantastic. Thanks, Sam. Thanks for those comments and reminding us that it's the public purse that pays for these public universities, and looking at some of the choices that could be made with the money that's spent as well. That's very important points. Now, our fourth speaker is Raewyn Connell, who is a Professor Emerita from the University of Sydney and probably Australia's top sociologist. And she's been a long time member, and she's currently a life member of the National Tertiary Education Union. She's taught in many countries. She's the author of the book that we invited her for today, The Good University. And her work has been translated into 19 languages. She has been very active in the labour movement, the peace movement, and of course work for gender equality. So if you want to turn your video on, Raewyn, I'll hand over to you.
And there, I hope, is the audio too. Are we coming through?
Yes, yes, very clear.
Good, lovely. Okay, thank you. Greetings from Sydney, where I'm speaking from a flat in the inner west of Sydney, and I'm very happy to acknowledge that Sydney is built on the traditional lands of the Darug and Eora peoples, and I wish to acknowledge their elders past, present and future. Thank you for the introduction. Here is the book that I'm going to speak from, not exactly about, but developing some points which are made in much more detail in the book, which came out from, I guess, partly from my history of work on education and social justice, knowledge, the sociology of knowledge, and a particular interest in intellectual work and the intellectual workforce. That's the, if you like, the long background of this argument. But it was very much triggered by industrial struggle in recent years in Australia in higher education. I've listened to the three previous speakers, and a lot of what I could say would simply be repeating in perhaps in slightly different language some of the points that have already been made about the rise of managerial power in universities, the advent of a competitive corporate culture displacing an older organisational culture in universities, the restructuring of the workforce through the casualisation of the teaching workforce and the outsourcing of the a good part of the half of the university workforce, which are the professional and support staff, and the change in the nature of work even in the tenured academic workforce, who've been more and more constituted as kind of middle management group. And I might perhaps expand also, as Margaret did, on the cultural changes that have happened in universities in this period, with the central importance of marketing and the way that that has been linked into ranking systems and league tables, and the way that in turn has created pressure on universities to abandon an older, austere culture centering around claims of truth and getting into the kind of misrepresentation and even outright lying that is characteristic of marketing enterprises. I won't repeat all of that. I will perhaps mention a slight disagreement we might have in how to analyze all of this. I would want to emphasize that what we often call neoliberalism or market ideology is not homogeneous. It varies in different parts of the world, different sectors too. And very importantly, it's not totalitarian, it's not trouble-free. There are contradictions and difficulties in managerialism, in market-based politics that actually give us some reasons for hope that offer cracks and potential points of leverage for change. One of those, I think, is the one I've just mentioned, that is the cultural change in universities towards a redefinition of universities as competitive firms and all of the misrepresentation in marketing that follows. This actually is in serious contradiction with the existing cultural rationale of universities and universities' claim on public resources. That is, that we are engaged in the search for truth, in the production of solid knowledge, and in teaching that is based on truth and disciplinary knowledge. So there are contradictions there that surface as tensions in the lives of university workers, but also give us possibilities of creating alliances for change with groups outside the university who value truth and knowledge in a whole range of ways, and which therefore give us possibilities of support. Having said all that, I want to spend most of my minutes thinking about agendas for change, about what the next stage might be if we agreed that things is crook in Tallarup, that the current situation of higher education desperately needs change. And I want to suggest right at the start, we need to be bold in thinking about alternatives and paths forward. We're not in need of minor tweaking around the edges, but of rethinking at a pretty basic level and developing agendas of change that have some intellectual and cultural power and can involve many, many social actors. So here's my agenda, 4-point agenda for change, if you like. First of all, we need to decommodify the operations of universities. We need to wean universities off their increasing dependence on fees. Now, there are grounds for doing this. We have had university systems that do not need fees to operate. Some of them still exist in the world, and it's worth knowing and reflecting on the fact that Germany, for instance, actually eliminated tuition fees as part of the funding of universities quite recently. It is something that is possible for contemporary societies to do. And there are bases for the decommodification of university work, or university operations, in some of the things that are very central to the university. For instance, in the research-based knowledge formation that is the basis of university curricula, or most university curricula, as I attempt to show in the first chapter of The Good University, the research-based knowledge process, the production of knowledge, produces commons, not isolated individual property, but produces common forms of social practice around knowledge. And that is even in our language. Actually, if we talk about publication, we forget that that means publication. Putting something into the public realm is actually central to the whole organization of research. And from that point of view, the kind of privatized research, which we heard about in the biomedical field, and which has certainly spread to some others, is actually parasitic on a larger public knowledge formation, which we can reclaim and re-emphasize as the core of what university knowledge is about. Now, to do that, we need, of course, some practical alternatives to fee-based funding. And I argue in the later part of the book, where I'm talking about agendas and perspectives for the future, that one of the key political tasks for change at the moment is arriving at some kind of social compact about the public funding of universities, of what level of funding a higher education system needs to operate reasonably, and what level of resources can be accepted by other social players as what is needed for a good public higher education system. So that, I think, is a central political task, finding partners for that kind of process and arriving at practical models for system-wide higher education funding. The second point in my agenda is that we need to shift the current model of universities in sectors like the Australian higher education sector from the current model that a university is best understood as a competitive firm competing in a market for the selling of services. We need to shift the model of a university back towards the idea of a cooperative unit within a larger public system, which is indeed, a well-established model of universities, one with which many of the people here will be familiar, but which has been so much de-emphasized in the rhetoric of policy making and university management that it has effectively been marginalized from the public realm. But that model exists. It is implicit in a lot of our work because universities are not actually separate and competing firms in a market in every way. In many respects, we simply rely on other universities. In any campus, we rely on other universities to form research teams, form audiences and critical respondents to our research, to participate in the construction of careers, the circulation of the university workforce, the circulation of student bodies, and so forth. There are many ways in which we are actually cooperative institutions now, even if that is marginalized in the public rhetoric of university managers and policymakers now. My third point is that we need to engage in and be bold in organizational redesign. There are models of industrial democracy that we can appeal to. We know a good deal about self-management of university departments, of research units, of university of sections of the university which have been able to manage themselves in more democratic ways in the past. This is not rocket science. We know a lot about practical democratic control in organizations. And it is a perfectly practical proposition to shift the decision-making and the construction of agendas for the way universities work back from the management consultants to whom this work is increasingly outsourced, back to the hands of the university workforce itself, and who knows better about how universities work and what they need to move into the future. And my fourth point is about that. We need models for the future, not just one model of the hyper-efficient corporate top-down controlled competitive firm. We need multiple models of how universities might operate, what tasks they might undertake, the balance of activities within them between research and teaching, different kinds of research, different kinds of teaching. There's a considerable diversity among universities in the world as they are now, which is more or less, obliterated by this one-dimensional league tables to which the attention of managers seems increasingly to be riveted. And it's up to us, I think, to multiply models even more than the practical models we have at present. There's never been a golden age in universities. I don't think we need to regard the present as uniquely bad and a degeneration from some fine state of universities in the past. Universities might have been more relaxed a generation or two ago, but they were still oligarchical. It's just that the oligarchs were professors rather than managers. And they were socially elitist. They had a very limited presence of working class students. Women had been increasingly represented among student bodies in Australia, became half of the student body at the end of the 1970s, beginning of the 1980s, but are still not present in anything like that proportion to the upper levels of the academic workforce. So there is still, there were inequalities in the past, and there's work still to be done on those kinds of things. But what I want to point to is something more interesting and more hopeful in our history, which is also marginalized in the current discourse about universities. We actually have a very rich global history of alternative universities, experimental higher education, popular research, radical universities, okay? When I was young, I was one of a group of crazy graduate and undergraduate students and radical staff who created a free university in Sydney. It lasted just a few years, as free universities tended to do, but there were scores of them around the world at that time, of people who were dismayed at the mainstream university of the time and thought, well, let's do it ourselves. And for a time, created very lively and interesting intellectual centres. But that's far from being the whole story. 100 years ago, the Bengali poet and novelist Rabindranath Tagore created what we might now call a decolonial college, which called Visva Bharati, which is now a public university in India. It's had its troubles, but it survived. He designed it as a centre for the meeting, in his language, for the meeting of civilizations, for Indian, European, Muslim, Hindu cultures to come together in one place and be available as a university curriculum. We have universities today in the Muslim majority world, which also attempt a major integration or combination of knowledge formations with different histories to produce a viable curriculum and agenda at present. We have Indigenous universities in Aotearoa, New Zealand, in Central America, in the Andean countries of South America. There are now very important models of how to do higher education with an opening to Indigenous knowledge, and indeed Indigenous knowledges in the plural, which we have to work on. And I could go on, as I do in chapter 7 of the book, through a whole range of practical, actual examples of alternative, experimental, and radical higher education research agendas, which we can draw on in building models for other forms of universities than the one we have now. So let me finish then by saying that we have, in fact, in our history and in our present practices, many resources for hope. The cooperative and creative elements in the labour process of teaching and research itself. The manifestos, the critiques and arguments for alternatives that have been bubbling up all around the university world within the last generation. The social struggles around universities, the fees must fall demonstrations in South Africa, the massive demonstrations in favour of public higher education in Chile less than 10 years ago, extraordinary. From an Australian point of view, the massive numbers of people who would turn out to demonstrate in favour of public higher education. So there are resources, there are bases for alliance, as we've already heard argued for today. I think this is that we have no reason to be hesitant in advancing these arguments. There are many possibilities for the future and many resources in which we could build alternative futures and democratic universities for the future. Thank you.
Many thanks, Raewyn. And again, some hopeful ideas, which I really liked, and thinking through how we could do organisational redesign and suggest models for the future. That's really good, and I'm sure it's given people lots of food for thought. And I have to say, through the People's Health Movement, I'm involved. We've established an International People's Health University, and I'll put the link.
Excellent.
It really gives a very different view to pharmaceutical companies than that, well, very similar to John's, but looks at alternatives to that. So thanks very much, Raewyn. I'm now going to introduce Alexandro Pelizon is going to provide commentary on Raewyn's talk. And we really invited Alexandro because of the leadership he showed in drafting a letter, which was eventually signed by 600 academics from about 36 universities, that was calling for better governance. And I think it would have, the better governance you were calling for would have resonated with the points that other speakers have made. So over to you, Alexandro.
Thank you, Fran. And I bring greetings, first of all, from the country that the ancestors have entrusted the Narakwal Banjalang people with looking after. And I also have to apologize, but like Nick said, the breathlessness of the last 5 months have led to this chronic, non-viral, non-bacterial cough, which is nonetheless extremely annoying for the audience. So I apologize in advance. Thank you, Raewyn, for the very insightful and very thought-provoking and very clearly designed series of steps forward by looking backward and moving forward at the same time. I have to say, I appreciate all your writing for quite some time now. And in doing additional research for this panel tonight, I just discovered that we share birthday, the same birthday. Although this is far less uncommon than it appears, it was certainly a very nice surprise. So if I, with your permission, if I can, I would like to weave a thread back to the beginning in order to, at the end, and conclude with a provocative question that hopefully will advance your 4-point agenda further and will also echo your historical and pluralist cautionary reminders in a way. I come from a tradition that is far more akin to the German one that you mentioned, Raewyn, and that very much like Colin and Dora mentioned in the chat, still elects and appoints the equivalent of the Vice Chancellor from within the professoriate, from within the university. So you can imagine how surprised I was when I discovered how different the Anglosphere has become from that tradition. And as we've heard today, many times we've heard the refrain that universities have to be treated because of the large number of assets that they possess as large companies. After all, how many times have we heard the refrain that we do offer a product, education? And I think it's needless to say how inane, or sorry, how reductive and reductivist such a comment is, because clearly one element, a very tiny element of what we do may be equated or may mirror the private sector. But certainly the very fact that we do not sell education, but that we assess education means that we are not exclusively operating within market forces, but rather we are very much more akin to what other public institutions do, such as the judiciary, for example. And certainly there is no call for the judiciary to show profit in order for it to be funded. But one thing actually, one note actually, the letter that people signed grew up to 1,600 academics, not just 600, but 1,600 academics. And I'm sure many more would have signed it. One thing that we can tell students who are told that they are customers, for example, is that rather than that out of $1,000 that they pay for their education, 300 roughly go to their education, 700 go to pay the exorbitant managerial salaries and the baroque capital investments that universities make. So that I think would definitely mobilize the student body if it weren't mobilized already. But let me just give and cast the gaze of a lawyer to the assertion that a university operates like a large company, because that is not really true. Large public companies mandate the appointment of their board of directors by their shareholders. University councils, as we know, are not appointed by their shareholders. There's a very small minority of councillors who are either elected or appointed onto councils. In fact, councils are autocratic entities. They elect themselves. Equally, in large companies, the CEO or our vice chancellor or vice chancellors are not part of the board of directors. The board of directors must oversee the vice chancellor, the CEO. Hence the separation between the two. In fact, actually, in most councils, in most Australian universities, vice chancellors sit on council. And so the result is that there's a much more tenuous oversight from council, with council meetings regularly attended by the entire executive team, which obviously tends to silence the voices of those who are appointed onto council. And virtually there are no in-camera sessions. I'm speaking as a council member now. And so it comes as no surprise that this lack of accountability, this distance of most council members from the activities of the university, favor an autocratic power on the part of the university executives. And the salaries are, in the word of a recent article that has just been published in the Financial Review, they are obscene. And the academic collegium, as we've heard, is relegated to discussing matters of compliance, with no meaningful input in strategy or performance. I'm purposely using the language of the Corporation Act to mirror the two. Research, as John actually very clearly highlighted, has ceased to be creative. Mariana Mazzucato has written very persuasively of the fact that over the last century, no creative idea has emerged from the private sector. The private sector may have innovated on the ideas that were created, but none of them, be it the Wi-Fi, the internet, the computer, anything that we can think of, emerged from public investment. Now, that Australian universities have morphed into quasi-commercial operations dominated by a very poorly devised corporate mimicry is, as Adam Lucas and others have written, the direct result of the very ill conceived Dworkin's first and Nelson later reforms, starting in the 90s. But, and this is the provocative question with which I would like to conclude, notwithstanding the fact that I, very much like most of you, I will continue to fight for a publicly funded university, and I will continue to put pressure as much as possible on the political sector for that discussion to transcend the boundaries of academia and to enter the halls of the public. But is it is it actually possible for a public university to ever be a good university, or ever again, if it ever was? So the original universities, Bologna, Paris, Oxford, Padova, Prague, they were the original, after all, the original corporations, but not in the sense of large companies as we conceive of corporations today. They were far more akin to what we would consider cooperatives today. There was power in that collective joining of the minds that happened in Bologna to examine the pandectics, la pandettistica. So is it time maybe to harken back to these original principles without going back to a mythical original state, which, as Rowan beautifully described, never existed and never exists? But is it nonetheless time to harken back to the original principles by which the institutions that we believe in and work for have been guided for almost a millennium? Is it time, in order to reclaim a good university, maybe to abandon the idea of a public university and re-embrace that of a cooperative one? Thank you.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Alexandro, with finishing with that wonderful provocative comment. And yes, certainly it was great that Raywin reminded us there never has been a golden age yet for universities. They have been elitist and quite masculine too, I think, in the past. So thank you very much. Well, we've run a bit over time, but I still hope that we can have a discussion. So could all the panelists put their screens on? Is that possible? Their videos on so we can see everybody. And you've had a chance to look at some of the questions. So I think if we go for another 10 minutes, it will be okay. I thought one of the interesting questions that Dora Marinova asked were, are students allies in the process of reimagining the university? And I noticed Margaret's already said not necessarily, but would anyone else on the panel like to address that question about students? Just put your hand up because I'll pass over. Okay, Nick, yeah.
Sure, I mean, I'm a sociologist, so I'm going to say yes and no at the same time. I think they can be. I think they can also make our lives incredibly difficult. And they can do that by seeing themselves as consumers, which of course we're encouraging them to do, so through no fault of their own. I think what we really need to remember here is that nearly every student that we teach now has never lived under a regime that is not neoliberal. They don't know an alternative. And I do think that there is a core group of them, certainly in my area, which is arts, humanities, social sciences, who are desperate for change. They see the problems. They want the critical information. Equally, I think that there is possibly a larger group who do not, and who see education as, you know, P's mean degrees. It's a means to an end to get that piece of paper so that they can earn more money. But I think that we can, just as we're finding allies amongst academics and professional staff, we can find those allies amongst students, and they can help us, or some of them can help us in this.
Yeah. Okay, thanks, Nick. Andrew, you'd like to contribute?
Look, just very briefly. Of course, students on certain occasions are powerful allies. We've just had the Fund Uni Fairly campaign across the sector, and students were a really powerful and important voice in that discussion. And of course, there are other issues where as has just been pointed out by Nick and others, where sometimes those voices contradict the sort of messages we're trying to do. So I think we pick our battles and our allegiances, but of course, students are important stakeholders on certain issues, and at times we've had very productive co-campaigns with students, which have been really positive.
Yeah, okay, thanks. Jenny?
I suppose I wanted to pick up Alessandro's final comment, really, because it seems to me, and something Raywin said, that the contemporary universities in the global north are very elitist organizations. Yeah, so the students are not representative of our societies in the main. There may be a few universities in some countries that are. So it seems to me the really powerful allies are the publics, different publics really, for this concept of the good university. And the model for that, if you were going to do that, would have to be something a bit more like Alessandro's model, which was a more cooperative model, like some of the models that, Raywin, you were talking about, both historically and contemporary, exist mostly in lower middle income settings, actually. So I visited one of the universities in Brazil, which was actually a co-op. It was a co-op. And so it does seem to me that we're on the wrong track if we think of students as a primary ally. We have to think about how we get the publics as primary allies, really, for good universities that are a different model, that are more inclusive, that are more contributing to social justice, that are, you know, that are genuinely about forging different kinds of societies, really.
Okay, thanks, Jenny. The next question I thought was interesting was the question of whether the idea of the university as a critic and conscience of society isn't possible while we have senior executives with high salaries. So is there, which probably you've already answered, but does anybody want to comment on that question?
Yeah, I will. I think the high salaries are reflective of the positioning of management and senior executives as a completely different beast than academics. They position themselves as much more important. And there's a whole regime of power that goes with that positioning that people are not going to be willing to give up at all. In fact, there's going to be quite a vicious fight to maintain that kind of privilege and maintain the divides that we're talking about between staff and students. And of course, the salaries are just one of the physical manifestations of that. And the argument that I heard in council again and again and again was that we're not going to get a good candidate to come in to do this job unless we pay these kinds of salaries. And it's self-perpetuating.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Margaret. Any other comments on that one? Yeah, Alexandro.
In fact, just a very quick one in that I've heard the same comment, Margaret, absolutely, that, you know, unless we pay really high salaries for the Vice Chancellor or the Deputy Vice Chancellor, we're not going to get a good candidate. To which I often replied, well, it's not working now, is it?
Nice one. Yeah, thanks for that one. I think a lot of us could very much sympathise with that comment. Another question that we've been asked is, you know, Anne Ricks asked, how do we encourage fearless inquiry and academic investigation and research in areas that industry does not find sexy? And I think Nick has partly answered that. And, you know, I think it is true that in universities there still is a lot of critical inquiry, but that could change as though us fortunate baby boomers who sort of lived through a period in which universities were a bit more liberal, that people are going to be much more constrained, as we've already said, and that the workforce is so casualised or on fixed term contracts that they're fearful to speak out. So anybody got any further insights on that question? Sam?
Can you hear me?
Sorry?
I just wanted to know if you could hear me without...
Yeah, very well.
I'll be really swift. I just wanted to acknowledge students in this formulation, because even though we talk about the extent to which teaching critically is difficult, it is hard work. There's an emotional burden that needs to be carried. And students usually go through, will oftentimes go through a period of resistance before transformations take place. But I want to acknowledge that I'm seeing increasingly year after year that students that I work with seem to be really thirsty for critical inquiry, and they take up action. And it's really a site of, I'm buoyed by that. And I find it's a space where, along with solidarity with colleagues, it can be renewing.
Yeah, okay, thanks for that. And I think that's my sense is that a lot of students are questioning structures in society more than maybe a generation ago. But Andrew, I think you were indicating. Go ahead, Andrew. Oh, sorry, I thought you wanted to speak. I'm sorry about that. No, you didn't. Okay, yeah.
Can I offer a suggestion there?
Raylin.
Which is that we can exaggerate the total character of managerial control in universities. There's a lot of things that the managers don't know goes on. There are ways in which the collective process of research itself requires critique of existing knowledge, among other things. So there is a certain intellectual ferment that's involved in the university being a research centre at all. And of course, there are possibilities of critique, dissent, and so forth in the teaching and learning process too. So I think we should recognise the many possible starting points for critique and innovation in university life, though also recognise the difficulty of scaling those up to institutional change, and that requires serious organisation.
Yeah, it certainly does. Thanks for that. One of the other things I think that's become clear in COVID, and I think people have commented on this, is that the public support for universities may be waning, because they do say, well, you pay, your vice chancellors get such big salaries, you rely on international students. And I think even the rarefication of publication maybe is at a point when universities may have to find they need to move back towards a more publicly focused social justice model to keep their social license. I think there's a real risk that they could actually lose that. Sam and Nick and John. Maybe John hasn't spoken yet, so I'll go John, Nick and Sam. Okay.
I just wanted to respond to the questions about ethical leadership in universities and whether that can make a difference. And, it can, but we need to bear in mind that the pharmaceutical industry have given very generous donations to ethics departments, and there's some evidence that that's corrupted the functioning of ethics within universities. The Sackler family, who are responsible for Purdue Pharmaceuticals, that have killed millions or hundreds of thousands of people with opiate addiction, have been very generous donors to ethics institutes. And you won't be surprised to hear that Purdue is going to go bankrupt, but the Sackler family have already secreted their billions and won't be touched by the negotiated settlement that's been reached, in spite of the mayhem they've caused in mainly the American health system.
Okay, thanks, John. Nick, if you'd like to comment on the social license idea, I think.
Yeah, it was just the idea that the public are pretty unsupportive of universities, especially during COVID. And I think one of the ways that the university management structure has tried to address this is through the idea of engagement and pushing us all to do research that's publicly engaged. And while I support the idea of that, of course, it's commodified. They've essentially pulled this into their fold, into their way of, they've metricized it, in other words. And I think this is another thing that we need to think carefully about: who we engage with, how we engage, and why we engage. Not suggesting that we don't engage, well, clearly we need to, but I don't think that we need to under kind of management rules. As Raywin said, there's an awful lot of opportunity for subversion.
Okay, well, I think that's probably a good note for us to finish on. I think by the chat and the response, I think this is a very topical webinar that people have really found intriguing. We have recorded it and we will make the recording available so people can use it for teaching, or they can use it to show colleagues in their universities. And I'd like to, first of all, thank everyone for attending. At one point we had about 120 people online, which was really good. I'd also like to thank Sue Gibbon, who's our one of our professional assistants in the Southgate Institute, and she's really trained me in webinar and how we run this, and she's there in the background making sure everything, and she's been communicating with everybody, so thanks very much, Sue. And of course then to thank all the brilliant speakers and panelists. You've just all been brilliant, and there's so many insights. It's really fantastic. So I'll give you a clap, you can't see, yes, and say good night to everybody, and thank you so much. Good night.